And I think there is pretty broad consensus, especially among people who pay attention to this program, that our democracy is a mess. Our next guests have written a book. They want to do something about it. The book, which I am holding in my hand for those of you watching us on video, Daring Democracy, Igniting Power, Meaning, and Connection for the America We Want. The co-authors of this book are Adam Eichen. Adam is a member of the Democracy Matters Board of Directors. He's a fellow at the Small Planet Institute. He was the Deputy Communications Director for Democracy Spring, and Francis Moore Lappé, so many of you will recall as the author of the groundbreaking book Diet for a Small Planet, published in 1971. I remember. She's the author or co-author of 19 books in total, covering topics like world hunger, living democracy, and the environment. So Adam, Frankie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Absolutely my pleasure, because I think this is the challenge before us now, isn't it? To try to reclaim our democracy as people look at what's going on in this country. I think people fall into despair all the time. If I have one takeaway from your book, besides the practical suggestions you have, the ideas for some of which I hope we're able to get into in this conversation, but if I have a single takeaway for your book, I feel it was written as, how do I put it, an antidote to despair. Is that a fair characterization?
That's fair.
Yeah.
Absolutely. A grounded one grounded in our actual experience, and it's very evidence-based, but yes.
So, okay, let me start with this, because as I say, I have been reading it, and there was a page where I thought, maybe I agree, maybe I disagree, but maybe I agree, maybe I think I know where they're going. So I just want to quote something with you, because by and large, I vehemently agree with what you're doing, but just as a place to start the conversation going, it's the beginning of chapter 3, Manipulating the Mindset. And you say, here we lay out strong evidence that America's particularly extreme market directing all ideology has taken hold through largely invisible means, and so I absolutely agree. And then you say, as you learn about the anti-democracy movements, so as you call it, please keep in mind what we're not saying. We are not simply blaming a handful of ultra-rich people and their allies. Adam, Frankie, I read that line, and my initial reaction before I kept reading was, well, why not? And I have a theory now as to why not, but what are your thoughts on that, either one of you?
Go for it, Frankie.
Frankie?
I could have a question.
Okay, Adam, why don't you take that one?
Sure. Well, so I think the thing is that while we are not just, basically the point is, while a handful of families have kind of disseminated this ideology through think tanks, through deregulating the media, through funding education institutes and the like, our basic premise is that, one, it's not all ultra wealthy individuals. There are very people of a lot of means that are fighting the good fight and do not subscribe to such a brutal form of kind of this libertarian ideology. So on the one hand, we're saying that it's not all ultra wealthy people, but what we're really trying to understand also is the mindset of these people. We're saying they're not, they truly believe the frames which they hold. They truly believe that by unleashing the market and by ensuring that the market determines all actions, that is the essence of liberty. Now, we disagree vehemently, and frankly, the system that produces is ultimately one of the most brutal forms of capitalism that we possibly can have. But we just start from we start with the frame that in order to really combat their ideology, we have to understand where they're coming from.
Well, I think
and from that where they're coming from is truly their framework of through which they view the world. And it doesn't mean they're not complicit. They certainly are. But what we're saying is we're not starting from just a blaming place.
Okay. Well, I think that's very interesting. And as you say, we are not simply blaming a handful of ultra-rich people and their allies. So what you're basically saying is there's a war of ideas underway, as I understand it. And Frankie, I think we had a little bit of a connection problem, but are you back with us? And do you have any?
I am.
Okay. As I asked the question and as Adam answered it, I was thinking of the words of the beat poet, Diane de Prima, that I quote sometimes: there is a war for the imagination, all other wars are subsumed in it, meaning that it's what you're saying, it's a battle of ideas. If we can get people to imagine something different, we are on the way to winning the war. Is that kind of what you guys are going after here? Does that make sense to you?
Yes, we very much believe in the power of ideas, and we flip the common expression that seeing is believing, and we argue no, believing is seeing, and that unless we believe in the possibility of real democracy, we won't be able to see it emerging. And the power of ideas that have their grip on us have been around for hundreds of years. This idea that human beings really aren't capable, that we are materialistic and selfish, self-centered to the hilt, and competitive, and we're not really capable of coming together in common problem solving, which is the essence of democracy. And with that kind of in the cultural ether, that sense of this diminished sense of our capacity, then we're very vulnerable to the hype saying, oh, privatize, turn it over to the market, and we'll be better off. Government is not the solution. Government is the problem, as Ronald Reagan told us. So we're very vulnerable to that message. And of course, government, if it is accountable to us, is a tool for our well-being, and it's been understood that way for decades in our country too. But it has been radically fought against very deliberately since the 1970s, telling us more and more and more that government can't function, trying to delegitimize government, in fact, so that it won't function. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy then that turns people against government. So this is really a call for believing in the possibility of democracy and confidence that human beings, yes, we can be selfish and competitive and materialistic. We also have evolved deep social capacity and sense that our well-being hinges on the well-being of the whole, and that cooperation and empathy and common problem solving are the essence of our humanity, and we can tap into that as well if we get the rules right. And right now the rules have been rigged against democracy.
So again, we are talking with Adam Eichen and Frances Moore Lappé, co-authors of the new book, Daring Democracy and Igniting Power, Meaning, and Connection for the America We Want. So, it's interesting. A couple thoughts came to mind listening to you two. One is the concept of learned helplessness, that in effect,
yes,
people are winning this war against democracy by teaching us that there's nothing we can do about it anyway. So we kind of shrug and walk away. So it's the battle begins with showing people what can be done and pointing to the victories that have been won. Is that a fair statement? And if so, what are examples of a couple victories we've seen so far?
Yeah, can I take this, Frankie?
Yes.
So I think that's exactly right. And, you have to show people that, one, that it's possible, and two, that it's essential, three, that there's a place for all of us in the fight. And that's kind of one of the kind of the three steps that we show that, is essential for movement building. And so, yeah, I mean, one of the kind of key, the oftentimes when we're going to speak, the kind of people, Frankie usually outlines all the kind of this anti-democratic stuff that's happened over the last 40 years. And then it's my job to kind of say, well, but wait, we have hope. And so basically, I mean, very quickly, the way I run down why we have hope, it's really simple. One, we're not starting from scratch. Overwhelming support for most of these policies, and most Americans, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, are just really upset and feel powerless. 75% of Americans believe that they themselves have too little influence in Washington, D.C. I mean, that's a stunningly high number. And of course, 85% of Americans want a fundamental rebuild or fundamental changes in the way we fund our elections. They believe too much money is in politics. So we're not starting from scratch on the base of, the level of support. But then kind of the second part, which is what you're talking about, is that really there are success stories on state levels. One of my favorites is automatic voter registration in Oregon. It's basically a way of streamlining and making more efficient the way we register voters when they interact with government agencies like the DMV. And basically, instead of filling out a bunch of different forms, you fill out one form with your information. You can opt out if you want, and then the DMV sends your information to the Board of Elections, and you're automatically registered. And in Oregon, in the first 3 months when it was when it went into effect in 2016, the registration levels tripled. And since Oregon became the first state to enact this kind of common sense but meaningful reform, 9 states in Washington, D.C. have followed suit. And that's just but one example of states taking the lead and then many other states following suit. And we chronicle many of these stories. Public financing, full public financing in Maine. They passed it in 1996. Arizona follows suit. And then, you have a couple of other states. It's more complicated. And then Connecticut in 2005. The list goes on. And as each state makes reform, we get more and more data, and there's more and more momentum showing that people want this reform, it works, and they're willing to act on it. And that, for us, I think, is a remarkable sign of hope that despite the last 40 years of the assaults on our democracy that have led us, mind you, to the Trump presidency, we claim, there is an incredible sign of hope, and really is embodied in this final step, which is what we proclaim, that there is a democracy movement building off of the grassroots consensus that there's a problem, that we have the solutions that are already been enacted, and that people are now coalescing and fighting on behalf of democracy itself.
That's a great answer, laced with specifics, Adam. And let's pivot in the last couple minutes we have left to a sort of broader or personal approach. About 5 years ago, I think it was, maybe 6, just before the Occupy movement appeared, I wrote about making what I called my Pascal's wager with the future. Now, a Pascal's wager, for those who know, Pascal said, I doubt the existence of God, but just in case there is one, I'm going to cover my bases and act accordingly. Now, that may be unsound as theology, but I made my Pascal's wager with the future. I thought, well, we'll probably lose, and the bad guys will ruin everything, but I'm going to act and think as if we're going to win. And I found that the more I did that, the more optimistic I became. And the fact is, as I look around me now, first the rise of Occupy and the Bernie Sanders movement, and I worked for Sanders, so I'm not neutral there, but to the opinion polls on a variety of issues, including democracy, I see in the midst of terrible things happening, I see enormous signs of hope all around us. Is that sort of philosophically attuned, Frankie, with what you guys are trying to do?
Completely. I love it. I love it. The way we put it is that it's not possible to know what's possible. So therefore, we're free to go for the world we really want. And when we say it's not possible to know what's possible, in that until we try, we will never know. And that's a spirit I hear in you. And so we also emphasize in that now we're learning that hope actually has power. It's not hope is not for wimps, I used to say, in the sense that it reorganizes our brains toward solutions, and despair does the opposite. It ensures defeat. So this is not blind hope. This is eyes wide open hope. But hope, the way you articulated it, I love it. And that's exactly in tune with our book.
Good. Okay. Well, what are either one of you, give us some closing thoughts, anything we didn't cover about the book, anything people should know. I assume it's available now. So closing thoughts from either of you, Adam or Frankie.
Well, I'll start just with saying that toward the end of the book, we have a chapter called The Thrill of Democracy. And this is one key aspect, is we're saying that what we're asking of people, this engagement, this engaging their full hearts, is not superhuman. Actually, it is a yearning in all of us for, and we describe what happened to us after we got engaged. in the democracy movement that we felt this big shift. We call it bonding with strangers, the idea that we're not so alone, that people whose lives are completely different from ours, they too want democracy. And that was empowering. And then another piece of that is a sense that shifted in us from being the outsider, pleading, oh, please, please, to no, wait. We are owners of this democracy, that sense of our own power. And that happened once we engaged. And then finally, civil courage is that Adam and I walked, from Philadelphia to Washington. I sat in on the Capitol steps, and we realized that once you do something you didn't think you could do, it makes you feel so much stronger and more optimistic in this positive way. We call ourselves possibilists, in the sense that it's not possible to know it's possible. So we try to make our personal experience very real, because we think they are actually pretty universal, that people want to have meaning and power and a sense of possibility in their lives.
Okay, well, I will give you not unequal time. Adam, we got about 15, 20 seconds. Any other closing thoughts?
I'll just say that we're indebted to the journalists who really broke the story of the anti-democracy movement, but our book is different than anything else out there, that we spend the bulk of our book on solutions, that we want to show people there's a pathway forward, period. And there is hope. There is hope. We will fix our democracy.
All right, well said. And we will have to leave it there. The book is Daring Democracy, Igniting Power, Meaning, and Connection for the America We Want. Adam Eichen, Francis Moore Lappé, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
My great pleasure. Thank you.